The small-town café sat comfortably on the corner of Main Street, its neon sign flickering as the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the sidewalk. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the buttery aroma of warm pastries, a familiar comfort to the regulars who gathered there. It was a place of simple conversations, nods of acknowledgement, and unspoken respect, especially when it came to Sarah Mitchell. Sarah had been a daily fixture at the café for years. Locals admired her for the quiet strength she carried, a testament to the resilience that had seen her through war zones and battlefields. The soft hum of conversations filled the air, punctuated by the occasional laughter from the corner booth where retirees gathered for their usual chess matches. Despite the welcoming atmosphere, there was an underlying tension creeping in that evening, an uneasy shift in the air. The moment the door swung open, the warm comfort of the café seemed to flicker, replaced by something rougher, more unsettling. A group of men strode in, their leather jackets adorned with skull patches and fiery emblems. The bell above the door chimed, but the sound was lost beneath the heavy clunk of their boots against the wooden floor. A hush fell over the café. Eyes flickered toward the newcomers, some customers instinctively turning away. The air thickened, the sense of familiarity in the café disrupted by the presence of outsiders who carried an energy that didn't belong. Sarah Mitchell sat at her usual table by the window, her back straight, her hands wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug. Though her posture was relaxed, there was an edge to her, an alertness, as if she could sense the shift in energy before even seeing them. Years in the Marine Corps had honed that instinct. Her wheelchair, a sleek black model built for efficiency rather than pity, was positioned in a way that gave her a clear view of the entrance. Her Marine-issued K9, Duke, lay obediently at her side, his golden coat shimmering under the dim café lights. He was a massive Belgian Malinois, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he picked up on the tension before Sarah did. Duke had been with her since her last deployment, where an IED explosion had cost Sarah the use of her legs. But while the explosion had left her body broken, it had done nothing to weaken her will. She was still a soldier at heart, sharp, disciplined, and unwavering in her strength. As the bikers swaggered further inside, Sarah barely lifted her gaze. She had encountered their kind before, men who thrived on intimidation, who fed off of the reactions they provoked. But she had no intention of playing into their game. The leader of the gang, Rick Razor Thompson, was an imposing figure. His beard was thick and peppered with grey, his face lined from years of hard living. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who was used to taking up space, daring anyone to challenge it. "Cozy little place," he muttered, voice dripping with sarcasm as his eyes swept the café. He flashed a grin at the barista behind the counter, who hesitated before offering a nervous nod. The other bikers chuckled, elbowing each other as they settled into a booth near the entrance. One of them, a lanky man with a scar tracing down his cheek, leaned forward and muttered something that sent the others into another round of laughter. Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee, unfazed, but Razor noticed her, and her lack of reaction annoyed him. His eyes narrowed as he nudged one of his men and tilted his chin toward Sarah. "Hey," he said, voice carrying through the café. "Ain't that something? A real-life war hero in our midst." His tone was mocking, laced with a smugness that made the hair on the back of Duke's neck rise. The dog let out a low, warning growl. his muscles tensing beneath his golden fur. Sarah didn't react immediately. Instead, she placed her mug down gently, exhaling before meeting Razor's gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. "Something you need?" she asked, voice even. One of the younger bikers snorted. "Just admiring the view. Always heard soldiers were tough, but I guess they didn't make you tough enough." "Ha!" A ripple of laughter followed. Sarah remained still. If they were expecting her to bristle, to lash out or cower, they were in for a disappointment. "Bet it was some explosion that did it," another biker mused. "Or did you just fall out of your chair one day?" More laughter. Duke's growl deepened, a guttural sound that carried a clear warning. But Sarah reached down, her fingers grazing Duke's collar lightly, a silent signal to stand down. Razor's grin widened as he took a step closer. "A dog for a babysitter? Huh, that's cute. Guess you need all the help you can get." Without warning, he lifted his boot and nudged one of the wheels of Sarah's chair, not hard enough to topple it, but enough to test her reaction. The café had gone silent. Every pair of eyes was locked on Sarah, waiting, watching. But Sarah, she barely flinched. Her grip on Duke's leash tightened, but her expression remained unreadable. And that, more than anything, seemed to irk Razor. "Come on, now," he pressed, smirking. "Aren't you gonna do something, soldier?" Sarah tilted her head, studying him as if he were a mildly interesting inconvenience rather than a genuine threat. Then, after a long pause, she finally spoke. "You talk too much." The bikers froze. And for the first time that night, it wasn't Sarah who was on the defensive, because in that moment, the tables had started to turn. The moment Sarah spoke, a heavy silence fell over the café. Then, laughter. Razor chuckled first, a slow, deliberate sound that spread through the group like a contagion. The other bikers followed, their jeers filling the air, shattering the tense quiet that had settled. "She's got some bite. Ha!" Razor mused, leaning down slightly as if trying to get a better look at her. "Too bad it don't mean much when you're stuck in that chair." The gang tightened their formation around Sarah, effectively cutting her off from the rest of the café. The regulars had already withdrawn to the edges of the room, casting wary glances but unwilling to intervene. The café owner, a stout woman in her 50s, hovered behind the counter, her phone in hand, but she hesitated. Calling the cops on men like this was like kicking a hornet's nest. Sarah remained still, her fingers lightly grazing Duke's collar. The dog's ears were perked, his body coiled with tension, awaiting her command. But she wasn't ready to give it, yet. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with a shaved head, crumpled a napkin and tossed it at her wheelchair. It bounced off her arm, landing in her lap. "Oops," he sneered. "Didn't mean to do that." Another one joined in, flicking a straw wrapper in her direction. A third biker snickered, grabbing a handful of sugar packets and tossing them onto her lap. It was childish, juvenile even, but it was deliberate. They wanted a reaction. They wanted her to flinch, to scowl, to give them some kind of satisfaction. Sarah exhaled slowly, brushing the trash off her lap with the back of her hand. No reaction. And that only made them angrier. "That's enough." The voice was steady, firm, carrying the weight of experience. All heads turned toward a table near the back, where an older man sat nursing a cup of black coffee. His face was lined with age. His once broad shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes were sharp, steel grey, reflecting years of military discipline. "Mind your business, old man," Razor muttered without looking at him. The veteran set his cup down and pushed himself to his feet. He wore a faded Marine Corps hat, its edges frayed from years of wear. "She served," the old man said simply, his voice carrying across the café. "Same as me. Same as plenty of folks who gave more than they ever should have had to." A few of the bikers groaned. One of them rolled his eyes. "Here we go." One scoffed. Another war story. Yeah. Another added, smirking, "Thanks for your service," or whatever. The old veteran's jaw tightened, but Sarah spoke before he could. "I can handle it," she said. Her voice was level, calm. She glanced at the old man, giving him a small, appreciative nod. The veteran hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. He saw it in her eyes. This wasn't her first fight. After a moment, he sat back down, though his fingers remained curled around the handle of his coffee cup, his knuckles white with tension. "Too proud," Razor muttered, shaking his head. He took a long, slow step closer, placing one boot against the side of Sarah's wheelchair. Sarah's grip on Duke's leash tightened. "You think you're better than us?" One of the bikers sneered. Sitting there all high and mighty, the air was thick with anticipation. The café had fallen into complete silence, everyone watching, waiting. Then it happened fast. One of the bikers, a younger man desperate to prove himself to the group, suddenly shoved the back of Sarah's wheelchair. The world tilted. She hit the floor hard, her body twisting as she landed, her palms scraping against the tile. Her wheelchair clattered sideways, spinning slightly before settling on its side. For a second, there was nothing, just silence. Then, laughter. Loud, raucous, gut-punching laughter. The bikers were grinning, nudging each other, pointing their phones at her, taking pictures like it was some kind of twisted joke. "Should have stayed in your place," one of them sneered. Razor smirked, sauntering over to her fallen chair. He nudged it with his boot, then, without warning, brought his foot down hard. A sickening crack filled the air as the wheel snapped. Another stamp. Another. By the time they were done, the wheelchair was in pieces. Sarah didn't move. She didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't beg. She just lay there, looking up at them, her expression unreadable, and that, more than anything, made them uneasy. Duke was in front of her before the bikers could take another step. His fur bristled, his body low. His lips curled back to reveal sharp, glistening fangs. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, the kind that made a man's survival instincts kick in, warning him that he had made a fatal mistake. For the first time that night, the bikers hesitated. Razor, however, wasn't one to back down so easily. He crouched slightly, his smirk still in place. "Easy, boy," he taunted. "You don't want to do something you'll regret." Sarah shifted, pushing herself up onto her elbows. Her gaze met Razor's, cold and calculating. "You should be worried about what I'll regret," she said. Razor's smirk faltered, just for a second. One of the bikers, clearly emboldened by the gang's previous actions, reached forward, fingers closing around Duke's leash. Sarah exhaled, and then she gave the command. In an instant, Duke launched forward. Teeth met flesh. A scream tore through the café. And just like that, the game had changed. The second the biker's fingers curled around Duke's leash, Sarah let out a single, sharp whistle. That was all it took. Duke exploded into action, with the force of a coiled spring. He lunged at the biker who had dared to touch him, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's arm. The biker let out a blood-curdling scream as he was yanked off his feet, crashing onto his back. Panic rippled through the gang. "What the—" one of them stammered, stumbling back. Another reached for Duke, but before his hands could get close, the dog whipped around, knocking him off balance with a swift, calculated strike from his massive frame. Razor's smug confidence vanished. His eyes darted between Sarah, still on the ground, unmoved, and Duke, who stood protectively over her. His growl rumbling through the café like distant thunder. Sarah's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Should have walked away," she murmured. The gang scattered in all directions. One biker lunged at Duke with a chair, desperate to fend him off. But Duke was trained, not just any dog, but a military-trained protector. He sidestepped the attack with shocking agility, then snapped forward, clamping onto the man's leg and sending him crashing into a table. Another biker made a run for it. Big mistake. Duke bolted after him, leaping with the power of a trained predator. He collided with the man's back, knocking him down like a bowling pin. "Get this damn dog off us!" one of the bikers screamed, crawling backward, clutching his bleeding forearm. Sarah, now propped up against the counter, watched the mayhem unfold with calm, controlled precision. Razor, the self-proclaimed leader, panicked. His hand shot toward his waistband, where a gleaming switchblade was clipped to his belt. The blade flicked open with a metallic snap. Sarah's eyes darkened. Razor lunged at her, blade in hand, but she was ready. Using her remaining strength, she jerked her body sideways, hooking her arm around the leg of a nearby chair and swinging it hard into Razor's knee. The impact was brutal. Razor stumbled, his balance shattered. His knee buckled, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The knife clattered away, skidding across the tiles. Sarah used the momentum to pivot her body, reaching out and locking Razor into a tight arm hold, a move she had drilled thousands of times during her service. For the first time that night, Razor looked afraid. "Who the hell are you?" he choked out, struggling in her grip. Sarah leaned in slightly, her voice low and lethal. "Someone you should have left alone." Meanwhile, across the café, phones were up, cameras rolling. Bystanders, once too afraid to step in, were now documenting everything. The gang, once so cocky, so untouchable, were a mess of bruises, torn clothes, and humiliation. One of the bikers, still on his feet, locked eyes with a teenage girl recording the whole thing. "You better not be filming this," he snapped. The girl smirked. "Too late," she said, holding up her phone. "Say hi to the internet, loser." Then, the wail of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the café windows, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The café owner, who had disappeared behind the counter earlier, now stood at the door, relief washing over her face. She had called the cops the second things escalated. Duke, still standing over a trembling biker, let out a final, menacing growl. He wouldn't move until Sarah commanded him. With a soft click of her tongue, Sarah signaled him. Duke immediately backed off, his training as precise as ever. He padded back toward Sarah, sitting by her side like a loyal guardian. The front doors burst open as officers stormed in, their voices booming. Everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them. The bikers, bruised, beaten, and thoroughly humiliated, didn't resist. They knew it was over. Razor, still pinned beneath Sarah's hold, let out a bitter chuckle. "This ain't over," he muttered. Sarah didn't flinch. "Oh," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "It is for you." The officers quickly assessed the situation. As they started cuffing the gang, one of them, a burly officer with a thick mustache, walked up to Sarah, eyes flicking between her and the wreckage of her wheelchair. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Sarah exhaled, rubbing her scraped palms together. "I'll be fine." The officer nodded, then glanced at the bikers, shaking his head. "Looks like they picked the wrong person to mess with." As the gang was hauled to their feet, Razor caught sight of the bystanders still recording everything. He snarled, his face twisting with anger. "You think this is funny?" he spat at them. A teenage boy holding up his phone grinned. "Nah," he said. "I think it's gonna go viral." The bikers were led outside, the flashing lights illuminating their battered faces. As they were shoved into the back of the police cars, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. Duke nuzzled her gently, his tail wagging. She reached out, scratching him behind the ears. "Good boy," she whispered, and just like that, the nightmare was over. But for the bikers, their humiliation was only just beginning. The bikers were hauled away in handcuffs, their earlier bravado completely shattered. Razor, once so smug and untouchable, now sat in the back of a police cruiser, his face swollen from where Duke had taken him down. He glared out the window at the crowd still watching, some people shaking their heads in disgust, others still holding their phones up, capturing every last second of his downfall. "You got anything to say for yourself?" one of the officers asked him. Razor scoffed, his lip curling in defiance, until he saw Sarah, still on the ground, being helped up by two officers. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't crying. She wasn't broken. If anything, she looked stronger than ever. And that's when he knew he'd lost. Inside the café, the owner, a stout woman named Linda, stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head as she surveyed the mess. "You pressing charges?" one officer asked her. Linda scoffed. "Damn right I am. They think they can just walk in here, harass a veteran, and destroy my business? Oh, they're gonna learn today." The other patrons nodded in agreement. Some even stepped forward, offering to give statements. The police were more than happy to throw the book at the gang, especially after seeing the footage making its rounds online. As the officers wrapped up their investigation, one of them turned to Sarah. "And you, ma'am, you wanna press charges?" Sarah looked at the broken remnants of her wheelchair, then at the bikers slumped in the back of the cruiser. She could see the fear in their eyes, The realization that they had messed with the wrong woman. She didn't need revenge. She already won. "I'll let the justice system handle them," she said simply. "That's punishment enough." Duke sat beside her, his ears twitching, as if he knew it too. Within hours, the footage from the café was everywhere. The video was raw, unfiltered, and completely damning. A group of leather-clad bikers tormenting a woman in a wheelchair, laughing as they tipped her over like she was nothing, only to be brutally taken down by her and her military-trained service dog. Social media exploded. Karma at its finest. They really thought she was weak. That's a former Special Forces soldier. Duke deserves all the treats. Never mess with a veteran. Never. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing witnesses and retired military personnel who stood behind Sarah. Even celebrities and high-profile veterans chimed in, sharing messages of support. One retired Green Beret tweeted, "Sarah, if you're reading this, you're a warrior. Those punks learned the hard way. Respect." Never underestimate. Veterans across the country rallied behind her, sharing their own stories of resilience and perseverance. And then came the biggest surprise of all. A local veterans organization launched a fundraiser to buy Sarah a brand new, state-of-the-art wheelchair, one even better than the one she had before. Donations poured in. Thousands of dollars within the first 24 hours. By the end of the week, Sarah wasn't just getting a new wheelchair. She was getting one of the most advanced mobility devices on the market, complete with all-terrain wheels, automated controls, and built-in tech to assist with her daily activities. When she saw the fundraiser, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years fighting battles alone, but this was a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Days later, Sarah sat outside her home, Duke curled up beside her, as she ran her fingers along the sleek surface of her new wheelchair. It was more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of resilience, of the kindness of strangers, of the unbreakable spirit she refused to let go of. She exhaled, letting the moment sink in. Everything she had endured, from her time in the military to the struggles of civilian life, had led her to this point. For so long, people had looked at her and only seen the wheelchair. They saw weakness. They saw limitation. But what they failed to see was who she really was. A fighter, a survivor, and a woman who would never back down. Duke lifted his head, sensing her shift in mood. He nudged her hand with his nose. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. Duke wagged his tail. She chuckled softly, looking out into the distance. The world had changed for her in the last few days. But one thing remained the same. She was still standing, wheelchair or not, and the next time someone underestimated her, she'd be ready, because strength wasn't about walking. It was about never letting anyone tell you that you can't fight back. And Sarah, she was always ready to fight. For Razor and his gang, life took a sharp turn downhill. The footage of their humiliation in the café sealed their fate. The moment it went viral, prosecutors had more than enough evidence to charge them with harassment, assault, and destruction of property. Most of the gang pleaded guilty, hoping for reduced sentences. But the judge wasn't feeling generous. Razor, the so-called leader, got the worst of it. 2 years behind bars for aggravated assault, with additional fines for damages. His fellow bikers weren't far behind, each facing months to years in jail depending on their involvement. By the time they walked free, they'd be nobodies. No gang, no reputation, just a group of cowards exposed to the world. Meanwhile, Sarah, she thrived. Thanks to the overwhelming support from veterans, community members, and even strangers online, Sarah became something of a local legend. People recognized her on the street, some stopping to shake her hand, others simply giving her a respectful nod. Kids in town even had a new hero, not some comic book character, but a real-life warrior in a wheelchair with a badass dog. And speaking of Duke, he became a symbol. A local charity was created in Sarah's honor, dedicated to helping disabled veterans get service animals and specialized training, ensuring that no one had to fight alone. The best part? Sarah helped train some of the veterans herself, because if there was one thing she knew, it was how to stand tall, even when seated. 1 year later, Sarah sat at a small veterans event, watching as a newly trained service dog was handed over to a disabled Marine. The woman, hesitant at first, reached out to pet the golden retriever that would now be her constant companion. Sarah leaned over, Duke sitting faithfully by her side. "He'll change your life," Sarah said softly. The Marine looked at her, eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and hope. Sarah just smiled. She knew that feeling, and she knew that one day soon, that doubt would fade. Because strength, it wasn't about legs, or muscle, or brute force. It was about spirit, about the will to push forward, no matter what life threw at you. Sarah may have been in a wheelchair, but she was still stronger than most, and she had Duke to prove it. Never underestimate someone just because they seem weak, because sometimes the ones you overlook are the strongest of them all.